Hey, everybody, it's a Plant-Based Business Hour. I'm Elysabeth Alfano. I'm thrilled to have you with me today. If you have not, you should go right ahead and subscribe. Please do that right now to the Plant-Based Business Hour. New interviews coming to you every week, which is why this week I will ask you, what about cheese made from cauliflower? What do you think about that? Is that possible? Let's go and find out because somebody has to crack the code for cheese. So let's do it here today on the Plant-Based Business Hour. I want to bring on Veronica Fil, who's the co-founder and CEO of Branded Foods. Veronica, thanks for being with me.
Thank you for having me on. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I hear that accent and I would love to say, oh, welcome from Australia. But of course, you're not in Australia anymore. You're in Los Angeles. When I think of somebody who decides to start a company and move across the world at the same time, I sort of think, what the heck were you thinking? So go ahead, tell me, what the heck were you thinking? Why did you move to LA right when you were starting a company?
Yeah, a week before we found out what COVID was as well. It was interesting time in history, but it's, I guess, because my co-founder, who's also my husband, and I, this is our baby. We wanted to work together. We wanted to build a company, and we just saw a massive opportunity. We knew that the US would be the place to do it if we wanted to, I guess, hit the right market at the right time, and we just went all in. Just took a risk, left our careers behind, completely walked away from them, and decided to become plant-based cheese moguls.
Yes, well, I'm excited about the mogul part for sure, because of course we are trying to crack the code for cheese. But let's talk a little bit about what you do with your cheese. So as I was saying in the intro, it's upcycled cauliflower and hemp seeds. Where did you get the idea for this? Because no one else is doing this upcycled cauliflower, cheese from cauliflower. And obviously we can talk about it, but there's, animal issues and environmental issues with cheese. So we all know that there needs to be a fix to that. But what made you think cauliflower? Where did that idea come from? And was it, because you don't have a background in food startups. So what made you think, oh yeah, it'll be cauliflower that no one else has ever done, and we haven't done a startup before, so now we'll go ahead and be successful?
Yeah, we certainly haven't done a food manufacturing startup, but we did open and run a fine dining restaurant back in Australia for about 5 years before we came up with this. And I have no experience in hospitality or cooking or anything like that, but my partner Sean does. So he has been a chef for the last 20 years. He's been in R&D for the last 15 years or so. And it just made sense to him. I have no other way of explaining why he would choose cauliflower and hemp to make plant-based cheese, but it was honestly just what came to mind as the most obvious ingredients that would have the right flavor and texture. People ask him this all the time. We did try a whole different range of stuff as we were going through that development phase, but we kept returning to these ingredients because they just made so much sense. It all started because he'd actually been playing around in the kitchen, like finding ways to use up the cauliflower scraps. Like as a chef, you're so geared towards using everything you can so that there's no waste, because you've got to always be watching your margins, making sure that everything is used. And so he started fermenting it. That's how he started creating the flavor for different, I guess, cheese styles. And he had them on the menu at the restaurant for a year before he told any of us that it wasn't real dairy. And the whole time, no one knew. I didn't know. Our staff didn't know. None of the hundreds of diners that came in every week knew. But it gave him the opportunity to be, in an open kitchen, standing there night after night, like 50 diners a night, watching them put it in their mouths, watching their expressions, watching them talk, like eavesdropping on them, and actually gauging their reactions. So that was his R&D phase, I guess, over the course of that year. When I found out what it was made from, I'm not in any way, a cook, but I am an economist. And I'm like, hang on. Do you realize that no one in the world has done anything like this before? And it's a huge market. And like what I worked out that it was free from top allergens. I'm like, hang on, this is actually really interesting. Like this idea might have legs for something a lot bigger. So that's how it all started.
Yeah, a restaurant is a great playing ground, if you will, for testing out ideas. And everyone gives you a hall pass too. I mean, you're meant to be this creative person, constantly reinventing the wheel, constantly coming up with new dishes. So it's a great place to start. And if he sort of, I don't want to say stumbled on it, it sounded like it was ingredients that made sense in his head, even if to no one else's head in the beginning, he was able to play with that. So, great consumer research, great market research right there. And of course, as you know, huge opportunity, cheese, that addictive element in people's lives, the one thing that makes them say, oh, but I don't know if I could, go vegan, let's say. So huge potential there. And then only environmental news is underscoring that, of course, all the time. But just to clarify, so you guys came at it really from the economic perspective, not from the, well, we're plant-based, and so we'd like to see this happen. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, our restaurant was not vegan, but I was doing the marketing at the time. And, years ago at the restaurant, we started to see consumer preferences shift. And I remember being at a trade show like years ago and tasting Beyond Meat for the first time. And I'm just like, that's when the mechanics in my head started ticking over, and I'm like, hang on, this is really interesting, like just exciting because it's novel and we're in the food industry and we just love the creativity of it. And I remember seeing a sashimi or a sushi that was also made from tomato. I'm sure you know who I'm talking about there as well.
I sure do. He's been on this show.
Yep. And I was just blown away. But, as the years went on, I just realized no one's doing cheese. Like, what are you going to put on all of these burgers? Every Beyond Burger still needs a slice of cheese in it that's not made from coconut oil or, I think that there's some great nut-based alternatives out there, but being someone who's not vegan, I'm guilty of like not buying them because I don't like the taste as much. Mm-hmm. And there are more people like me. In fact, the majority of consumers are probably not going to buy it because it's either too expensive or it just doesn't replicate the sensory experience of eating real dairy closely enough to get them over the line. So we figured, hey, I've got a chef on my hands that focuses on, sorry about the doggy in the background. I've got a chef on my hands who focuses in multi-sensory dining experiences. Like our restaurant was all about not just taste, but, we'd hire actors, musicians, engineers, scientists, psychologists. Like we'd pull out every trick in the book we could to create an overarching dining experience that wasn't just about taste. So we figured, what if we did that on a food product? Took that same approach, and we'll start with cheese. We had a whole bunch of ideas at the time, but cheese seemed like the biggest market opportunity, so we ran with that.
Yeah, I love that. And you're so right. If you compare yourself to what's on the market now, it's usually, if you're talking about a plant-based cheese, it's usually heavily oil-based, kind of nasty in a way. I mean, does the trick if you're not looking at it. If you're melting it on something and then you're putting a bunch of other stuff on it and you eat it, then okay, you might not know. But if you look at that label, not a whole heck of a lot to get behind there. And then you have nut cheeses, but there's always a distinct nut flavor in that. I don't mind them. I like it, but it's not cheese in the way that we're looking for that kind of answer to, what's going to crack the code for cheese. So I tried the grounded foods like a year ago and I liked them, but the progress you've made in a year, I have to say I was floored. I didn't think you'd get as far as you did in a year. If you can talk about it, what kind of differences did you make to the product from when you were just starting R&D to now that you're in market?
Very little. I'm actually really impressed that, we're blown away every day that we managed to do this. Like we're two people from Melbourne, like a little fine dining restaurant in Melbourne, Australia, that managed to come to the other side of the world with, like, as a company, less money than competitors, like less resources than competitors, no R&D team, just one guy. And we still managed to get this far and do something that no one in the world had done before. I can't explain it still, but Sean did an amazing job at scaling up as a first-time food manufacturer, scaling up his kitchen bench recipes into a massive facility. The way he tells me, it's just like running a really big kitchen. Very little had to change. But where we did have a lot of learning was in all the other elements around it, like, working with a co-packing facility, shipping, logistics, like getting into retail. That's where all of the massive learning experience has happened.
Well, yes, because I remember talking to you about a year ago, and you didn't really have much of an R&D team. I guess what you're saying is that you still don't, that you've still been leaning on Sean and his sort of magic, creative magic, as you will. But I thought that to myself as you were moving across the world. How are they going to land in a new city where they're foreigners? Granted, they speak English, they don't have language working against them, but you've got to find locations to set up. Everything has to be new from scratch, in addition to building the product, which is new from scratch, and then scaling it up. So, hemp seeds, which I deeply believe in, and I think we're going to see that hemp is the answer to a lot of things, and that from an environmental soil standpoint, there's lots to get behind there. But, still hemp is relatively expensive, even if the cauliflower, upcycled cauliflower is inexpensive. So I'm just amazed how it's all come together. Any moments of nervous breakdown?
Oh, many. I had one a couple of weeks ago. I put it on LinkedIn because we had our first hate review, which wasn't even like, I know I shouldn't get upset about that because it wasn't even logical, but it was all the like online bullying and personal private messages, like talking about my face and like just really nasty stuff.
They went at you personally.
Yeah. That's why I was so upset about it. But I realized later that it was actually written by a PR agency that we'd rejected the pitch of. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm not upset about it anymore. That's
really? How did you realize that it was them?
Because I recognized the name. I'm like, hang on, where have I heard that name before? And I went back through my emails and saw that they'd pitched us twice. And I'm just like, that's wow. Maybe it's just coincidental, but yeah.
Sure.
But
maybe
I was way less upset after that because it's like, all right, well, that's just take that with a grain of salt. And I think it's much more upsetting if it's genuinely someone that really doesn't like the products and thinks that it's gross. But fortunately, we've had really good feedback.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. What is, because you've only been to market now, I want to say a month, and most of it has been direct to consumer on your website, although you are branching out to Whole Foods. Is that accurate?
Yes, we should be in Whole Foods by the 10th of May, and about 130 odd locations around California, Chicago. Just sticking to this side of the country first. We don't want to bite off more than we can chew. But we'll just progressively roll out nationally over the next few months.
So somebody is wondering, I think this is interesting. I haven't seen this kind of question before in the Plant-Based Business Hour. Is the cauliflower cheese recipe available, or is the cheese sauce available for purchase? Yes. Oh my God. The cheese sauce is definitely available for purchase, but I don't think you're giving out any recipes. Do I have that right?
We're not giving out the recipe.
I wouldn't think so.
I think even if someone tried at home, they wouldn't be able to make it. It's not like we're just blending up cauliflower and hemp into a milk or anything. It's quite a complicated process.
Yeah, of course. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show the Grounded Foods website so that this person can buy it. So you just go to groundedfoods.com and you can see, here's the hemp seed cream cheese, onion and chives. I've had it. So super good. Let me show you the cream sauce, which is right here, 100% dairy-free, nut-free, gluten-free, soy-free, cheese-free cheese sauce. Now I have to say, and obviously just go to the menu here and you can, shop. So you can get it here. I have to say I was blown away. Here are all of our cheeses with the cheese sauce. So prior to trying your cheese sauce, I have to say I came to the cheese sauce world a little bit of a snob, like, oh, I like hard cheeses or maybe like stinky French cheeses. But, in the Velveeta family, I'm not saying this is Velveeta, do not get me wrong. This would be an awful comparison because it is so tasty and so good. I thought, well, this kind of liquid cheese almost isn't my go-to. I was wrong. I was absolutely wrong. We took it with us sailing and it was so handy because you could squeeze it. So, on a sailboat, when you're moving up and down, you don't always want to have knives and cutting things. So it was great. We passed it around everybody. They could squeeze. It was just wonderful. So very good. And that fermented cauliflower really brings in some notes, I'll say, of the French cheese world.
Yeah, it's actually my favorite product. But it was interesting, that one nearly didn't make it to market because we had some investors and some mentors early on that were like, you know, it's just a sauce. Like it's like, it tastes too much like Velveeta. It's like, yeah, people buy Velveeta. A lot of people buy Velveeta because it's still on the market. Someone's secretly buying this stuff. So why don't we just make a healthy version of it, a plant-based version of it that, yeah, doesn't have all the crap in it. And I think it's going to be our sleeper hit.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm not surprised actually because I had low expectations and I was blown away. So let me ask you, let's get back to scale a little bit because it's one thing to have an idea and do it in a restaurant. Well, then gosh, lucky you. But most people don't. They do it in their kitchen. They're like, okay, I've got this great idea. For example, I make a great bacon in my kitchen, just FYI, everybody. But to get from my kitchen with my bacon to Whole Foods is a world away. And I'm wondering what you did to scale because again, you're in a new country, new startup, new food product, and then to scale it is its own bag of tricks. So how have you guys done in that department?
Yeah, I think because we'd started our own businesses before, so we had like the experience of working with investors and, you know, things being difficult and not choosing the right investors, things not going smoothly. Like we went through all of that experience in our last business. So this time around, we're like, all right, if we're going to do this, we need to get into an accelerator first and just like get the right infrastructure in place. Like this time we're going to get proper lawyers and people in our team, rather than just get stuff, you know, friends and people to do it for free, like what happens in restaurants a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So we're really lucky. We got into the Mars Seeds of Change Accelerator back in Australia. And that just gave us some prize money that we used immediately to get the right infrastructure in place. So this time got our lawyers, filed a patent, got our trademarks, got an accountant, all of this stuff, and really just absorbed as much information as we could from all of these mentors. Didn't necessarily take on all of their advice, but at least like heard everything, heard every perspective, and then at least we came in with all of the information at hand. And very soon after that, we were accepted into the Big Idea Ventures Accelerator in New York. That was like only about 6 weeks after the Mars one. And within a week, we were living there, like just didn't go back to Australia, got our visas and just ran with it. Just, you don't get that opportunity every day. So we figured just take it now.
Yeah, that's incredible. What kind of capacity, because you said that you're going to supply California, the West Coast, all the way to Chicago. What kind of production capacity do you have at the moment?
Look, that's a huge obstacle for us. I think it is with most plant-based businesses at this point. Like, finding a co-packer as a startup is already a really, really difficult scenario, no matter what kind of product you're making. A lot of co-packers won't even answer your emails because you're not big enough yet. They don't know you. They've got minimum requirements. And then to find one that's a plant-based facility just narrows it down even further. To find one that's allergen-free narrows it down even more. So everyone in the plant-based space at the moment, I feel, is scrambling to get into one of these very few co-packing facilities. We were lucky that we found one in very close to Los Angeles, but we're already looking at additional ones because, I mean, we've already been approached by big box retailers and there's no way that we'll be able to supply them unless we start looking for additional facilities.
Then we should talk after the show. I have a facility in mind in Chicago that might be of help, and then another one in LA that's just coming online. So stick around after the show. Yeah. So I've noticed that your packaging, as we all saw when I showed the website, is black. And when I think of cheese, I usually don't think of black. So what were you thinking with the packaging, and has that been well received?
Yeah, people seem to love it. Honestly, we looked at the way that we'd marketed the restaurant. The restaurant was super successful. You know, it was very glossy and shiny and fine dining and very minimalist, and people loved that. So we just figured no one's actually, at the time, like no one's done that in a plant-based food brand and just made it really sleek and sexy. So we just applied the same approach to the branding of a plant-based cheese. My philosophy in marketing is always just to do the opposite of what everyone else is doing. So we literally took a photograph of the cheese aisle and just figured what is the absolute opposite packaging that we could do so that it would stand out the most, and it was black. If everyone else had black packaging, we'd probably do the opposite of that, make it really colorful and noisy.
Yeah, I love that philosophy. Just take a snapshot of what's going on in the aisle and then think how you can stand out in that aisle. And it's a great place to start. I love that you're asking that. Okay, so I also wanted to talk to you about how you're communicating with the consumer. We've talked a little bit about this on Clubhouse before, but what I'm doing with my clients at Plant Powered Consulting, I can't tell you how many people come to the market like this. Like I was saying, they're in their kitchen, they have a product, they love it. They finally figure out a way to scale or to replicate, to do batch cooking. So then they focus on investing and getting the funds. Meanwhile, they're working on a name that they like and it might be great. They're putting together some packaging. They've got the R&D and the product, and they're so focused on the product, usually because they're mission driven, usually because they're plant-based or vegan in some way, and this is meaningful to them. So they want to see this product fill a hole in the marketplace, and they're pushing R&D, scaling, product, packaging. It's out there. They have no communication with the consumer. It's not just that they haven't done press releases or they're not even sure what press release they would do or their communication strategy. They have no way of talking about their product to the consumer. A lot of them just think plant-based is going to be enough. I'm a plant-based X. I'm a plant-based Y. That should be enough. People should get it. But of course, you can't do that anymore. In today's very busy landscape, getting busier landscape, you need a much more tailored and curated conversation. And plant-based means different things to different people. If you ask Tyson, plant-based means half meat. And if you ask an older person, plant-based means health. And if you ask a younger plant-based person, it means revolution. So it means different things to different people. It takes on an emotional meaning different to different people. So what kind of communication strategy have you guys put in place?
Well, we came from a very fortunate position. Like Sean and I feel like this business, we were born for it. It's the perfect thing for both of our skill sets, him in terms of food and R&D, and my experience was in behavioral economics. So like watching the market all the time. Back when I used to work as a government advisor in one of Australia's, I guess you'd say, nudge units, where you use economics and psychology to gently try and steer consumer behavior so that people make better choices for their health, not smoking, exercising more, that kind of thing. But I think that experience and thinking in that way and designing policies in that way has worked very, very well. And from a marketing perspective as well, the approach that we're taking is not going after vegan consumers because they're already educated around making better choices for the environment, for their health. But we're very interested in hitting the mainstream audience and just gently steering people into choosing a plant-based cheese some of the time. It doesn't have to be always. Just incorporate more of plant-based options into your diet, and do it through just making products that are super tasty. They're novel, they're exciting, they're different, so that people don't feel like it's being forced on them and that they're having to make sacrifices or compromises.
Yeah. For me, when I think of something like grounded foods, so you can use this if you'd like, if it's helpful, I just think of joy. I just think of, oh my God, the burden is lifted. I don't have to think about the environment. I don't have to spend any of my time on this stuff. I get taste. Let's move on. I get taste and I've checked all the other boxes and I've checked them so fast, I don't even have to think about what they are. I just know this is a good decision. And I got taste on my side. It's joy because all this other burden and noise is lifted from me. So very, very fun.
I think that's the way that the food system is going to go as well. Increasingly, year after year, there is more of these options available. We have the technology to make stuff that's just better on all fronts. And I think that, the big food manufacturers that are still stuck in the 80s are going to have a bit of a tough time on their hands over the next few years trying to keep up with all of these startups that have just found solutions.
Well, it's very interesting. I love that you say that. So it's taking the conversation a little bit in a different direction, but they're not nimble, right? They're the opposite of nimble. They're so heavy and sedate in their ways. Very hard for them to turn the Titanic, but they do have those distribution channels and they had those advertising budgets. And it's really those advertising budgets that I want, right? So when I see somebody like JBS buy up Vivera, part of me, Vivera being a plant-based company in Holland. A part of me is, and I think it was the third largest in the ecosystem. I think, oh gosh darn it, I really sort of hoped that they would have gone IPO and gotten their own footing and stayed Vivera. But the flip side is, the more JBS comes onto the plant-based scene, they have a contract with Aleph Farms doing cultivated beef. They have an innovation center for plant-based. The more they do this, the more they dedicate advertising budgets to plant-based and educating the consumer. And that really is a boat that lifts all tides, or a tide that lifts all boats, or whatever that expression is. So I'm not as disappointed as all that.
Exactly. I completely agree with you. I guess on one hand, what worries me is that we got into this situation in the disgraceful state that the food system is right now, you could say, because of these multinational companies that are so focused on profit efficiency, just making everything cheaper, faster, always about the profit. So on one hand, I'm concerned that if they end up owning all of the startups in this space, then we'll be right back at square one, where everything gets eroded back to making it cheaper, faster, nastier. But on the other hand, is it really a bad thing if they're spending all of their resources on, building the plant-based space?
Yeah, it's tricky business. I have to say, I have this conversation with myself and on this show all the time. I want those resources to go to plant-based. It is a little bittersweet because they did get us here, and very ironic that their focus has always been efficiency. And yet, what could be more inefficient than growing grains? Do you give those grains to people? Those grains that have fiber and protein? No, you give them to animals. And then you have to wait, and you have to give the animals more land, more water, more time. They don't have enough food because they take 9 months, 12 months, and that's with the drugs, folks. Got to cut down more trees that we sequester carbon that we need for climate change. Are we using the trees for that? No, we're cutting them down. We're making more grain. Are we giving that grain to people? No, we're still giving it to animals. So animal agriculture is the most inefficient system. And obviously the horrors that it is. So they've try as they may to make it efficient, but it is not an efficient system despite the pushes of factory farming. So
exactly.
And the damage it's done to the planet is pretty extreme, and animals, obviously, and our health, by the way. So it's a frustrating double-edged sword, but ultimately everybody has to get on board. And the more people who get on board, big companies and small startups, the better, the faster it can be. So interesting discussion. I'm taking a little bit of a side angle here. Of course, I want to get back to talking about grounded foods, but because you were, I can't really say in government in Australia, but I'll say that you were with the economics department in some way. Do you have any sense for at least how Australia, and then also how the US, might be investing in research for plant-based solutions?
Personally, I haven't been in Australia for about a year and a half now. But when we left, we really, we didn't see that Australia would be the best market for us to launch this product in. It's just not big enough in terms of population and just in terms of market development, like the evolution of consumer acceptance around plant-based products at the time. I'd say it was still a few years behind the US.
Okay.
What happened after that, though, right after we left? The bushfires, ravaged dairy farms. So an entire industry, already not a sustainable industry. Like, dairy farmers already don't get paid fairly for their resources. There is nothing about the entire industry that makes sense in my head anyway. But then, bushfires ravaged, then COVID. Trade borders closing, just all of these factors stacking up, I feel really accelerated the growth of the plant-based industry in Australia, and the opportunity that exists there as well for farmers to start converting some of their land so that they can actually be part of the plant-based economy and grow at that accelerated rate with some of these brands that are just, soaring in the market right now. So I think that there is huge opportunity there. But in terms of policy, like obstacles, the tyranny of distance, literally the distance that that is involved in distributing products around the country because it's so widespread. These are all factors that I think are still creating massive hurdles.
Yeah, something I'd like to see is a lot more government investment into research, because now leaving the sort of microcosm, if you will. It's not microcosm because it's so big, but the conversation about factory farming and going to a larger scale. We saw at COVID, what does a pandemic do? It disrupts jobs, supplies, job markets, and food supplies. So it almost becomes an issue of national security as you see borders shut down because you're not getting food into places like Singapore, and they realize, okay, we better be more food independent, et cetera. There is this intense need to have more efficient food systems that deliver on nutrients rather than just quantity, which is how the system was originally built, to deliver vast amounts of food at a low price rather than nutrition at a low price. So I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done across the globe. I think the US is pitifully behind here. And it almost becomes like a political issue of national security when you think that people are going to fight over food, land, and water. Really, food and water. That's what people are going to fight over. So that's the war of the future I see. And so, not that I want this to be the case. I'd love everyone to share their food and get along, but that doesn't happen. So I'm surprised that governments are so slow. Particularly the US is one of the slowest to get behind a new food supply system.
Absolutely, yeah. And if we look at Australia's geographical proximity to Singapore, as well, which is a real development hub at the moment.
Yes.
If only they would allow us to bring hemp into the country. That's the only reason why we're not there. But
why wouldn't they allow hemp in Singapore?
It's not legal to use in a food product. So that is part of why we're in the US to launch as well. I think that eventually that might get overturned, but it wasn't the right space and time for us at this stage.
Interesting. That's so interesting. I see just a huge future for hemp. I love the taste of it, unlike other things that you have to mask the taste in plant-based foods, et cetera. I love hemp. And then I think there's a lot of chance to use hemp as one of the crops to end monocropping, sort of have more diversified cropping for soil reasons. I think there's a lot of potential there with hemp, which is going to help you in bringing down the price of hemp, which I think is still relatively expensive as an ingredient. Is that right?
It's not so bad. I mean, compare it to nuts, it's vastly less expensive than nuts. So, I mean, overall, for a product like ours, when we're using imperfect vegetable, essentially scraps as well, the cost of goods is so remarkably low. And that's what excited us about using these ingredients, because we can actually bring something onto the market that is affordable and accessible for a much larger audience of consumers, not just the ones in LA.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, they got the memo. They don't really need it. They're all fine and well. Okay, so we're talking about all the ways that Grounded has sort of, with a little fairy dust and like magic, because there was so much that could have gone wrong. You are now finally to market a year later. Tell me about what did go wrong. What did go unexpected along this journey that's been about a year for you?
I'm glad you asked that, Elizabeth, because I love listening to business horror stories and podcasts about, how I built this, that kind of thing. And I like listening to what went wrong. I hate listening to all of the good stuff because I want to know the gritty stuff so that, you can learn from it and hopefully avoid that in your own business. But for us, it's got to be co-packing for a start, just a nightmare to get everything up and running. So much of a time suck on Sean, just having to be there constantly. I think I see a lot of startups, getting into a co-packing facility, kind of handing over the formulations and then letting it go. I guess we're not geared that way. There's no way, this is our baby. There's no way that we could just let it go like that. So it requires constant, monitoring, quality assurance, like him actually being there physically in the factory, making the products with the staff, telling them how to do it, telling them how to pack it, which is really not efficient. But at this stage, that's what we're working with.
Yeah.
And then I'd say the other massive pain point is direct consumer shipping, probably for a lot of businesses as well, that are not using a shelf stable, product. It's chilled. So that's even more difficult than frozen, because if you think about a frozen product, it's just got to go into dry ice. It's just frozen, it gets shipped. Whereas with a chilled one, it's got to stay within a very specific band of temperature in the entire logistics chain. Every time it's picked up, handled, it's got to stay at that temperature. So we had an absolute nightmare in the first couple of weeks of launching. We'd gone to all of this pain to find an eco-friendly 3PL provider that, instructed them on the packaging that we wanted them to use, got all set up, everything was looking good. And then the first reports we started getting out from customers was that the packages had arrived in styrofoam, like literally the worst possible thing we can imagine. They hadn't used any padding around the product, so everyone's containers were arriving burst open. We later found that there'd been some kind of discrepancy in the temperature logs, so at some point the products have just been left on the floor somewhere, I guess, and are now just going moldy because the shelf life's ruined. So we ended up having to replace so many orders. But that's what you got to do. We just ended up emailing every single customer, asking them how it arrived and if we can replace it for them if there was anything wrong. It's just what you have to do.
Yes, yeah, right. No, you have to, because you've got one shot at making that impression. And so you have to get that right. I have heard other horror stories like this of people who went to enormous pains to get that eco packaging right. And then they find out that their package has arrived in styrofoam. Nothing will make you more mad.
I was livid when I found, I was so hysterical. I was ready to fly over and just rip them to shreds. I was so mad.
Yeah. Well, it's funny, that you've talked about these kind of logistics and not funding. Funding is often a problem for people. I mean, now you're seeing more and more investors come into the space, but these investors are being bombarded with options that they can invest in. How did the investment process go for you? I think your round was oversubscribed, if I've got this right, at 2 million. And you had a valuation at the time that was 6 or 7. Do I have that right?
Million, yeah. We were very fortunate. We started fundraising. It was literally the same day that the stock market crashed and in New York, and like the world started shutting down. And I remember watching it on TV and just thinking, oh, this is really suboptimal timing.
There goes my life.
Yeah, like at that stage, everything was going well. Like Team Grounded was, we were the hero startup team that just managed to, rock star over from Australia. Everything went right for us all of the time, super fast moving. And then suddenly that hits, and the $10 million valuation that another investor had given us, who was going to be our lead, just like that's totally down the drain. They just stopped all investments. All of these investors that we'd been speaking to suddenly nowhere to be found. And so it was a really, really nerve-wracking few months as our bank account just dwindled and dwindled and dwindled. We had only a few $100s. By the time that the fundraising round closed, Sean and I just had a few $100s to our name, just hoping desperately that we wouldn't be deported. And then suddenly the floodgates opened. I think, after the initial kind of disruption of COVID, once investors started getting comfortable and more confident with the market again, and realizing that plant-based brands would probably be on the right side of the investment equation coming through this. Everything just opened up. We ended up with all of our term sheets in 1 week, and then another much more pleasant problem arose of which investor do we go with.
Well, I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. Sort of back to back, you had crisis. You've been talking about your crises, let's say, back to back, sort of the troubles that came along that you didn't expect, and then the trickiness of a raise. I'm wondering if you could give startup entrepreneurs tips for both. So tips for starting and then tips for going through a raise.
I think one question that I always think about just in terms of business planning is like, is venture capital actually right for this business? Because a lot of the time it's just not. It's not the only way to get money, and not all businesses are, the right fit for venture capitalists. You've got to, they're not in it just for, most of the time, just for the love of launching food brands. Like it's a business model as well. They're looking for a certain type of business that will grow at a certain rate and make a certain amount of return. And so, for Sean and myself, we knew very early on, like, this is not the kind of business that we want to launch at the local farmers market and spend 2 years like selling by hand and making in our home kitchen. If we're going to do this, the opportunity is right now. We've got to work really, really fast before someone else does it before us. And though being an economist helps, because I know how to be attuned to the market and work out what our actual opportunity is there and communicate that with investors. But for comparing that to a restaurant, for instance, not really an attractive business model to pitch to an investor. So taking it back to the beginning, we're in Los Angeles because our original idea was to open a plant-based restaurant in LA. And the cheese was just my side hustle. I figured if Sean's going to open this restaurant, then I can keep myself busy by commercializing some of his plant-based recipes that I think would be a good fit for the market. And, it'd just be a small hobby business. But the first investor that we spoke to about the restaurant offered us $2 million just for that cheese recipe in the back of our pitch deck. He just wanted that recipe and he'd give us $2 million for it. And that was the moment when I'm like, whoa, Sean, we need to, let's just spend a bit more time thinking about this. I think this idea might have legs. We're onto something. And that's how the whole business opportunity began.
Wow, that is very much a fairy dust story, I'll say, because it isn't often that people have an idea and they get immediate feedback. I'd like to give you $2 million for that, particularly if you can execute it, then.
I'm really glad we didn't just take that offer. But yeah, I think part of why we were successful is just having that mindset of agility, like being able to ditch what your previous plan was and go in kind of a completely different direction, which I think from what I've seen, sometimes startups struggle with that. If they're so attached to a certain product because they love it so much, they sometimes struggle to take on consumer feedback and be able to pivot in a different direction if it doesn't do very well. Whereas I think for Sean and myself, we don't care. Like it's just like, what? No one wants it.
Move on.
Don't care. Yeah.
Yeah. Pivot's the name of the game for sure. I love that tip for entrepreneurs. What tips do you give for choosing strategic investors? I think most people think like, I just want the money, but it's actually much more than that.
Yeah. Well, we had the experience of having the restaurant where we had a very non-strategic investor. It was 100% angel investor. He'd given Sean the opportunity to open $1 million restaurant at the age of 31. Like what chef says no to that, right? Yeah. But I think going through that process over the years and working with them, we realized very quickly that actually makes life really tough if the investor doesn't understand the industry, and you're always kind of having to explain everything, always butting heads. It really holds the business back from evolving and moving forward. So this time around, we already had that in the backs of our minds. We're like, we want people that are experienced in this area that, not just, I guess, the more corporate style investors that are just cashing in on plant-based because it's hot and they just want a plant-based company in their portfolio because they see beyond an impossible and they get excited. So we certainly got term sheets from more of the corporate side of the investment community, and it was a real struggle to say no to those opportunities because I guess we're going after a mainstream market and I can really see validity in working with investors like that. But we ended up going with Stray Dog Capital because at the end of the day, I just really trusted them. I think the team is fantastic. They were so supportive, so just rational and clear about their mission, so much experience in the space and a wonderful reputation. So yeah, I've never looked back. I think we made the right decision.
Yeah, Lisa Faria, CEO of Stray Dog Capital, has been on this show. And you are right. They are brass tacks. Let's get down to business. They've got a mission. Let's move on. Let's do it. Let's not fool around. It's really wonderful. So now one of the things that I thought you might say is never go into business with your husband. I don't know. Maybe you can share with me what that's been like.
Yeah, I think, look, the truth of the story is Sean and I met on a dating website a week before his restaurant opened. And I always laugh because like, what chef a week before they open a restaurant
does this to themselves? Yeah.
To date. But it was OkCupid where they, you go through this huge questionnaire and it matches your personality profile. And he and I matched at 99.9%. So that's something that you don't ignore. I'm like, well, I guess I have to meet this guy. And I just immediately after meeting him, I was already thinking of business ideas in my head as soon as I met him. And I just knew straight away that we'd probably either get married or build a business together. And we ended up doing both of those things. And it just works. So I think we're very similar in our mindset. We're very similar in the goals that we want to achieve, and just completely aligned. Yeah.
Well,
aligned with goals.
a lot of fairy dust going on in your life, because most people, not only can they not say that they have a successful business or do a successful raise, but most people don't have a successful marriage either. So, and then to put your marriage under stress of a business, oh my gosh.
I know. And living in New York in a 1-bedroom apartment for 6 months while fundraising and starting the business was not easy, but it works for us. And I think it's, really just that match of personality and wanting to achieve the same thing at the end of the day is what got us there.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, I know he is more of the sort of leave me to the creativity of my food, but of course he's always welcome to come on the show if he would ever like. Okay. So you guys have your pulse obviously on cheese. We opened the show with, who's going to crack the code to cheese beyond grounded foods, which of course you're going to say, we've got the answer, it's grounded foods. But maybe if you could talk about the cheese industry as a whole, what are your predictions, I'll say the next 3 to 5 years for cheese? That can be plant-based or not. Where do you think things are going?
Look, I figure that plant-based cheese is going to follow the same trajectory as meat and milk alternatives. In fact, from the research that I've seen from Good Food Institute, it seems to be growing even faster. Look, I think investors often get stuck on thinking that there is going to be this one breakthrough company that solves everything, right? That's always what they're looking for, the ones that are going to cure, they're going to cure all ails and be that breakthrough one that gets the exact right formulation. Whereas think about how many cheese styles there are in the world. Like, why would we just use one formulation to recreate those? There's so many exciting companies doing all different interesting things and experimenting with different ingredients and different processes. Why wouldn't we use all of them and just create a whole spectrum of different forms and flavors and just novel ways of doing things? I don't think that we're going to just have one breakthrough company that does it all. So while I'd like to say that grounded foods will be 100% of the market, we won't be. There will be one of a few, I think, that do it really well.
Yeah. Well, I see that while cheese isn't, I see cheese growing, obviously, and I speak of plant-based cheese. I see, obviously, it's only an upside potential, and so many problems for regular cheese, environmental, animal, meat and dairy both run on very tiny margins, very hard to have a business last when you're losing market share and you have small margins. So, I mean, I just see more and more people switching over. But unlike meat and unlike dairy, plant-based meat, plant-based dairy, milk, cheese is still looking for it's possible. It has been nailed. It is really there. And most plant-based cheese can't do that, at least at any scale. So I think that's why so many investors put their hopes into grounded foods, because it does have that potential to really answer it for people as a beacon of hope. Does that mean that grounded foods would be 100% of the market? No, but it would say to the rest of the world, it's possible. Someone's doing it. It's right now it's still kind of a bad second.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really shocked that there hasn't been more innovation in this space. It just hasn't kept up the pace with milk and meat analogs over decades. We're still relying on the same, I guess, a lot of companies that are already well established, they're still just, I guess, perfecting the same formulations, maybe changing out the starches here and there and putting in a different protein of some sort, but it's still the same process and the same essential formulation at the end of the day, which is why when Sean did it, he's like, I'm going to just do something completely different if I'm going to create a product that's different, just totally different process, different ingredients, and start again from scratch.
Yeah. And therein lies really the brilliance. And as I say, this hope for, so someone's on it. It's on its way to being solved. Okay. Talking about on its way to being solved. Usually I ask this question, kind of an exit question on the way out. Usually ask this question like with 10 years in mind, but the world is moving so quickly now, I don't even bother. What do you wish you knew 3 years? You can make this 5 if you want, or 10. What do you wish you knew 3 years ago that you know now?
That's a really difficult question. I think the complexity of the complexity of actually getting a food product onto a retail shelf and all of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes to make that happen that consumers don't know about, like all of the processes and ingredients that don't necessarily get declared on the label to prolong shelf life, We've learned so many horrifying things about the food manufacturing industry just going through this firsthand and understanding what happens behind the scenes that consumers aren't necessarily aware of, in order to get things that meet their expectations, like, the unbelievable shelf life that's expected on products, to get them to the point where they can sit in a warehouse for 3 months before they actually arrive on the shelf. And that's just the basic expectation. Like, how are you going to make a completely natural food product?
Right. Yeah.
If it's going to achieve that impossible standard. And then at the same time, seeing all of this pushback from a portion of the consumer market that are expecting, plant-based companies to do everything like a silver bullet. Like, is the packaging completely sustainable? Is it completely clean label? Is it the best tasting product on the market? Is it also allergen free and obviously plant-based? Like, no.
And cheaper. Yeah. Yeah. And it's very disappointing because it says the mindset of the average consumer is, if I can't do everything, I will therefore do nothing. So if you don't change everything in one product here today, I therefore will not change my ways and won't start on a path to something that is better, even if not the best. And obviously better is better than nothing. So, and we're only in this innovation stage. We're just the beginning of plant-based. So every day is a new R&D innovation to make better, closer to the best. But it's a very frustrating mindset. I think of that mindset as really coming from naysayers who are intentionally not wanting change. I don't know if that's the general demand of the retail grocery store. Is it that it has, like, the grocery store buyers, are they looking for silver bullet or nothing?
No, I don't think it's a reflection of the retailers, and they're honestly driven by consumers as well and what they expect. But I do completely agree with you. I was just thinking about it the other day. It's almost like an excuse for some people, a reason to not even try unless it's 100% perfect. And they use that as an excuse to, not bother. It's hard to go plant-based. It's like, I'm not vegan myself because I struggle with it. It's like an addiction, eating animal products. It's just so tasty. I always feel like how can I not be vegan at this point? I know all of the arguments. I know what devastating impact that has, but there's something, I can only explain it as sheer addiction to eating such tasty food that I'm not quite there yet. And I think a lot of people are in that position too. We need to stop making excuses for it.
What is your food that you can't give up? Is it all of it, or is it like one or two things?
I think it's just it's the texture of protein. Like, for me, I haven't found a plant-based meat that can recreate that, that three-dimensional, biting into a big chunk of protein and the satisfaction that you feel in your tummy from that. I think that plant-based burgers have done it. Sausages have done it. There's bacon alternatives, but yeah, just that steak is something I haven't found yet.
Okay, so a client of mine, Juicy Marbles, I'm going to have to get you their plant-based steak. I know you know who they are because we had quite a press release together. Yeah, so very fun. Wow, it's funny. All the things you describe, I think, are all the things I was dying to get rid of, and I just didn't know that plant-based was an option for me. But I hated bite. I could never eat a steak. It would just be the most disgusting thing for me. Actually having to work against. And I knew it was the muscle, but even as a kid, when I didn't know about factory farming and things, I just didn't want to have to chew that. And then you always get some sort of gristle or some sort of like accidental thing that wasn't supposed to be there. It's just disgusting. So I didn't have that, but cheese was tricky for me. I had to kind of work around that. And I did find the addictive properties of cheese. I thought it was going to be so hard. I'd like psyched myself out mentally. I thought it was going to be so hard. And then I like buckled down and did it for 10 days. And I was like, I don't miss that stuff at all now. Like, I only missed it, like sugar. I only missed it the first 4 or 5 days. And once I get sugar out of my system, I don't miss it anymore. And once I got cheese out of my system, I didn't miss it anymore. And then I realized how happy I was I'd gotten over that hurdle because I was a little bit a slave to it. So I was really grateful for like, oh gosh, I stuck it out 4 or 5 days. And that's nothing, right? We're not even talking about any kind of major diet thing. You're just talking about getting through Monday through Friday. And it was behind me. So it's really, really great. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you mentioned before about predictions for the next 10 years. I mean, I really think that it's a psychology, it's a consumer psychology play. Over the next 10 years, it will be Gen Z, I think, who starts really shifting consumer behavior. And I believe that it will just get to the point where it is not acceptable to eat animal products anymore. It will be embarrassing. It'll be like the way that we treat smokers these days, whereas before it was, very common to sit down at a dinner party in the 80s with a cigarette with babies around, right? Whereas I think in 10 years from now, it'll actually be like something that people will be ashamed of, to eat meat in front of others and indulge that way. It just won't be socially acceptable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think people will start to look at others like, you're littering. Like, how could you do that to the planet? Like, what are you doing? And by the way, that planet is my planet too. That air, it's my air too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that water, it's my water too. Can you imagine if you walked into an airplane with a lit cigarette? People would be like, take him out and shoot him. I mean, like, I think it's going to be like that. Like, people are going to say, like, don't mess with my air in this airplane with your secondhand smoke. And they're going to feel that way about the environment and animal agriculture. And I think big companies know that that's coming for many other reasons. They also know that they don't have the resources of land and water and time like they used to. So they really want to switch over fast, but they also know that society's going to turn on them, and they don't run on big margins. So they want to get out in front of it. So that's the major change I see. I guess what I'm saying is that we're already seeing incredibly fast change, but this is going to be nothing compared to when it really skips over. I think in 2 or 3 years, it's going to be like, we're going to wake up and it'll be like, well, of course you're plant-based. What's wrong with you? Yeah. Like it'll just be almost one day to the next. It'll feel like.
Yep.
Okay. So running around in your fast, super busy life, let's say you don't have time for lunch. What's your go-to snack?
I love the cheese sauce on just tortilla chips or any chips. Mm-hmm. It's the perfect application. Like, you've got the squeeze pouch.
Yeah.
My chip. That's
you can be like walking around. You've got the cheese pack and you're like, yeah, I use it on pretzels. They're really super good. Okay. If you're having a bad day, and you might be, if your environmentally friendly packaging shows up as styrofoam, what is the phrase that you say to yourself to get yourself back in the game?
I don't know if I can say it on your show.
Oh, go ahead. Go.
I usually go to my partner Sean and ask him. I try and ask him for comfort, and he usually says to me, like he did on the day that we got the hate review, he's like, "Tell him to eat a bag of dicks. Don't care." And that always cheers me up. It's like, yeah, all right.
I actually haven't heard that expression. That must be an Australian expression.
It's pretty Australian, yeah.
Okay, noted. I'll keep that in my arsenal. I love it. I will bleep that out, because as of today, I should have told you this when we started this radio show, when they started this podcast is now a radio show. And so it will be on a station in Canada and 2 stations in the United States. So welcome to WLUW, WCGO, and Muskogee Information Canada Radio. Oh my gosh. So welcome to those radio stations. This is your first radio show, and that section will be bleeped. Okay. So to everybody else who is with me on podcast, and you got the full version of this, remember to subscribe and share this with your friends. And if you're watching live on social media right now, of course, you should be sharing it and commenting and all those great things. I want to tell everyone goodbye, and I will see you next week, except for Veronica. She's going to stick around, but thank you to everybody watching on all of our live socials. This will be on podcast very soon. Thank you, Veronica, for all you do, for bringing us great upcycled cauliflower and hemp cheese. If you guys don't have it, what the heck's wrong with you? Go to groundedfoods.com. Go ahead and try it. You've got the future right here in your hands. Veronica, again, thanks for all you do. I hope you'll come back.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you for having me on. I mentioned at the start when we were talking before that all the year that I was fundraising, I was listening to your show, hoping that one day, we'd have a company big enough that you'd invite me on.
Well, this has been really fun for me as well, because I tried Grounded products a year ago, and I was like, okay, the little engine that could, I hope they get there. And then I just tried them like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, damn, we've got an answer. So it's been very, very exciting for me as well. I say goodbye to everybody online. Veronica, stick around. Everybody, thanks for being vegan, and I will see you next week.